Hey everyone, John here. Welcome back to another tutorial. This time we're going to break down how I created this look using Blender with After Effects and Sapphire. And I'm going to walk you through pretty much step by step the process that I took in Blender because it's so easy. And then we're going to jump across to After Effects and I'll go into detail breaking down how I created this look. All right, let's get going. All right, so the 3D model that I created was, as I mentioned, created in Blender. And let's walk through this step by step. I can show you how easy this was. So I was doing some experimentation in Blender and I happened to be working with an icosphere. So I'm going to press Shift A, choose Mesh, Icosphere. This is just what I happened to be working with when I was experimenting. And to that I applied Remesh. So I'm just going to do a search for Remesh. That's the Remesh modifier. By default it's on voxel. I'm going to change that to blocks and bring that down to 3. So that remesh that. You can see the wireframe there. And next I applied the build modifier. And what this does, if I just move the time indicator, you can see as I advance forward, that builds on. And as I reverse, it builds off. So I don't really want to build this. I actually want to have, use this as a graphical tool to create a model. So I'm going to just switch this to randomize. Just choose a frame that looks good. I think it was probably something like that. And then just apply the remesh and apply the build, and that's now a model. Okay. So next what I did was in face mode, just select all, and I use mesh tools. So you can turn mesh tools on in the add-ons. It's a free add-on that ships with Blender. And I chose multi-extrude. And those are the settings that I use. You can see a 0.06 offset. And I'm going to use this later. So what I'll do is I'll just duplicate that and just turn that one off, come back to this one. And for this one, what I want to do is once again use mesh tools and choose face inset fillet. Like that. It gives me a nice filleted inset. You can see the settings I use there. Now, I want to inset again, but if I use the same face inset fillet, it actually gives really horrible geometry. So I'm not going to do that. What I worked out is that if I just do an inset instead, just like that, just a little way, so that I've got nice, even spacing between the verts and nothing's crossing over. So I haven't got, geometry crossing over itself. And then before I actually accept that, I want to just change the depth a bit, like that. I think that's probably about enough. And then I want to scale this. So in order to scale around individual origins, I just press the period key and just choose individual origins. Hit the S key and then just scale that in like that. And if I want it to stick out a little further, I can just press Alt S and then just fatten that up a bit. I think it's actually pretty good. Maybe a little bit more like that. Okay, so there we go. So now what I want to do in edge mode, just pressing 2 there, is come up and choose select and select sharp edges. And I've already got my settings in there, so 21.4, and that gives me all of the edges that I need. And I come up and under transform, I'm going to choose to increase the mean bevel weight to 1. Okay. Then I can just click away and deselect. And now you can see I've got blue bevels. So they're fully weighted. Okay. So now I can apply a bevel modifier. And I'm just going to choose limit method weight like that. Increase the segments, hold down shift and just pull that amount right in just to give me a nice little micro bevel there. Something like that. Okay, so we can see the facets there. So I was going to right click and choose shade smooth by angle and we get something like that. So we'll put a material on that in a moment. I'm just going to turn that off, come back to this one. Now it's still connected, so I'm just going to now delete that face or those faces. And that looks pretty good in itself. But what I did to this one was just add the wireframe modifier, just like that. And that gave me a wireframe look, which was fantastic. So with them both done, I added a material. Now the material I created was very simple, just created it in here in Blender. And it's basically just you know, a light gray with low roughness, so just so that it can pick up the HDRI. Just select this one as well and just add that in there. So if we have a look at that in Eevee, look at that. Really nice metallic look. And that's all really thanks to this HDRI and the brand new Grayscale Gorilla Studio. So all of the assets that I used to use in Cinema 4D are now finally available for Blender users, which is great for me because I switched from Cinema 4D. So I got access to all of the collections, HDRIs, materials, and all I did was come across the HDRIs and just browsed through them and chose this one here. And I clicked to copy and then copied that link across into Blender, and it just updated straight away. So I can use these now in Blender, which is fantastic. Using materials is actually even easier. And it's so good to have finally a really extensive library of materials for Blender. Here all I have to do, because you can see down here I've got a link to Blender. Here all I've got to do is download the material and it automatically puts it into Blender for me, ready for use, which is fantastic. So definitely check out Grayscale Gorilla Studio. So that's the main object, and there's the wireframe. Let me just come over here, and then you can see that. Really makes that pop out, which is fantastic. So with that done, all I did was select this one first, come across to File, and chose Export, GLTF. And in here, just making sure, I can deselect animation, just making sure under Data that Apply Modifiers was selected, and also under Include Selected Objects. So did that for that one and also this one, the wireframe, ready to take across to After Effects for compositing. So let's go across to After Effects now and take a look at that. Okay, so here in After Effects, I've just rendered out a proxy. This is a full resolution proxy so that I can just do really quick previews of the final composition. And you can see I've imported obviously the main.glb and the wire.glb, the ones exported from Blender. So let's dig right down into this and we'll go into, first of all, the main.glb comp. So here it is at the bottom. So that's the 3D object imported into After Effects. And it still amazes me that we can use 3D objects in After Effects like this now. You can see how fast that is. It's really, really fast. And you can see the texture on there, and you can see actually it's reflecting the same HDRI that I used in Blender, the Grayscale Gorilla HDRI. So I've imported the Pro Metal Studios image, the EXR, into After Effects, added an environment light, and for the environment light source, just chosen that layer. So I've got full flexibility to light this using the HDRI directly in After Effects, which is great. It's so nice not to have to pre-render from Blender. So that's that object, and we've also got the Boris Effects logo in here. I'll just turn that on. So that's also a 3D layer. You see, I've just grabbed it in here and just positioned it inside because After Effects 3D layers are in the same 3D world as imported 3D objects, which is great. And you can see we've got this really nice move here where this is rotating around like that. And it's nice because you can see the logo through there, through the little window there. And as it rotates, we've got this main window where we reveal the logo, which is really nice. And I didn't actually plan that in Blender. As you saw when we exported this object, or before we exported it, as we were setting it up, I just moved the time indicator and just chose what I thought looked like a good frame. So it just worked out really nicely that we see it in the side and then we see it in the front like that. So the animation is coming completely from the camera and the orbit null. Just very quickly, to create an orbit null, just right click on the camera and choose Camera, Create Orbit Null. So, I mean, I've done 1,000 tutorials, probably more, and I've probably mentioned countless times that when I animate a camera, I like to animate the camera's Z position. You can see I've got keyframes for the Z position. So the camera's starting in close and it's pulling back. Okay, so that's all I've done there. So I've animated the camera separately from the null. So for the null, I've animated the Y rotation and the Z rotation. So Z is giving us that banking. And of course, there's the orbiting created using Y rotation. So you can see it rotates around. And watch what happens. It goes a little bit past the point. So it overshoots, right? And then it just eases back into place. I like that overshoot. I think it makes it look really natural. So if we have a look at the graph here, see how we've got this overshoot here? So it's coming up and it's going a little higher, then it's coming back down. So it's overshooting that final keyframe's position, which is really nice. Now, the logo is a little dark. So to fix that, I just used a parallel light and just pointed that parallel light down at the logo like that. You can see it there. And if we have a look at the settings, you can see I've used a smooth fall off. If we choose no fall off, it just lights the background a little too much. And inverse square wasn't quite giving me the result I wanted, so I chose smooth. So that way we're getting mostly the logo illuminated with little effect on this object here. If we just turn it on and off, have a look and see where it disappears in the reflection. So I'll just turn it on and off. So it's not too much. There's a little bit up here. There's a couple of little areas where we see it, but I think if anything, it just adds to it anyway. And one other thing I wanted to just point out here is, see how that curvature that we created in Blender really works well with this metallic HDR. If we had a lot of angles here without any curves, metal doesn't look as good. It's really nice to have curved surfaces, and it really works beautifully, you know, with this curvature here. So as it moves around, as the object moves, it reflects that HDRI and just looks so good. You can't really go wrong with metal, can you? It just looks so good. So here's how it looks so far, and it's definitely starting to look good. It's got loads of depth, and that metal looks really great with that HDR environment. All right, so now back in the main comp, I'm going to solo this bottom layer. So here's our main object, exactly how it looks in the main object comp, except we've got a little bit of depth of field going on here. And I didn't render any depth of field. Well, I didn't actually render out of Blender, so how am I using depth of field? Well, that's thanks to the 3D channel extract effect. So let's just come down to the bottom here and take a look at that. We've actually created a depth map using the 3D channel extract effect. So by pre-composing the 3D object and then applying 3D channel extract, I can create a depth map, which is super useful. So I'll just turn that off and then select this again. And I've used Sapphire's Z defocus effect, and I've chosen for my Z buffer that composition. So, and also making sure I chose effects and mask so it recognizes the Z buffer effect or the 3D channel extract effect. So here you can see I've just done some subtle depth of field. I can play around with the focal depth and I get full control over the depth of field, which is so useful. Really like that. In the end, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to use much of it or any at all, so I decided for something really subtle. You can see that's slightly out of focus in the background. And it's easy to set up, and it's just great to have that option, not having to go back to Blender or, you know, your other 3D app and, you know, render that out. So fantastic. So that's the 3D channel extract. Now, at this point in the creation of this, I was thinking this is really starting to look good, but I want to start using a few more Sapphire effects because I wanted to showcase them. And I tried tile scramble, and as soon as I put tile scramble on this, I thought, whoa, check this out. So tile scramble literally just scrambles your layer into a bunch of tiles. This is pretty obvious, isn't it? And it's got built-in speed options. So it's actually fairly slow. I've knocked it right back, so I didn't want it to be moving too much, but that can be animated. You can see I've just adjusted the scramble rel X and just broken that up, really fractured it up, play around with the tile amount and, the Z distribution. There's a bunch of settings in there that you can adjust. And by itself, it doesn't look, particularly interesting because we're losing that 3D-ness. So I wanted to bring the 3D feel back. And also we're losing the logo as well, right? We can't read the logo. We move towards the end of the animation and we can't read anything. But it is nice how we're getting this sort of fly eye kind of look where we're, duplicating the logo a few times. It's good for the branding. So above that, we have main object again, so duplicated. And you can see I've literally just duplicated the layer and masked it off, just with a little bit of feather around the edges. So if we turn that on and turn that on, so now we've got that. So we've got total ability to read the logo now, which is great. I haven't even animated the mask, but you can see how we're still getting a kind of connection between the unscrambled layer and the scrambled layer. You can see it's still got that sort of ghosted kind of feel to it. So it's not completely scrambled, which is nice. But in order to really reintroduce that 3D depth to this, the 3D model look, I use the wireframe object. So there's the wireframe object. Let me just solo that. So it looks a little strange, and we're going to go into this comp in a moment, but this isn't being scrambled. So with all of these three together, we get that. So we're getting a much better sense of that 3D object. Let's go into this wireframe object and right into here and take a look. So there's our wireframe we saw from Blender. Remember, it's exactly the same as the main object. I just deleted those faces and I used the wireframe modifier. And it's using the same lighting. You can see it's beautiful how it's picking up that HDR. Now, how am I getting the same animation? Well, I've got a camera and an orbit null in the main object comp, and I've got the same one here, but in order to keep them linked, all I did was, come back to the main object, select the main camera, and choose Edit, Copy with Property Links. Okay, then I just pasted that into the wireframe composition, wireframe object, and if I just press EE, you can see everything is linked up via expression. So any changes to the camera orbit null or the camera in the main object comp will get reflected in this comp. So it just keeps everything together. So if I decide to make any changes later, I'm not going to break the look because these have to be in sync, right? They have to match exactly. And everything else is the same. Same HDR and same environment light. Okay, so let me just come back to here and let's break this down because it looks a lot different, doesn't it? I'm going to just turn all of those effects off. So there's our base wireframe, and at the top we have Ultra Glow, and this is the secret sauce for this. What I wanted to do was I wanted to have glints of light moving along the wireframe, and I was thinking, how am I going to do that in 3D? And then it occurred to me that Ultra Glow has this option down here, highlights. So let me just turn that off and on again and see how we get these highlights moving across it. So these are animated highlights based on the highlights texture. You've got plasma or micro, and they're animated, so they're moving along the model. So they're not moving in 3D space, but they're moving along where the pixels are of this layer. So it kind of looks like they are moving in 3D space because you can see them. You can see them in the distance and you can see them in the foreground. But it's really just being laid over the top. And look how it's giving it that beautiful glow. Really, really nice. And once I did this, I thought, that's fabulous. But if I'm going to lay this over the top of the main object, then you're going to see all the background wireframe on top of this, and you're going to lose the effect. So I had to think of a way to be able to get those nice glints, but not have this looking like two layers laid on top of each other. So what I did was I used Set Matte. So with Set Matte, this is why I've got the main object in here, because I used Take Matte from Layer, Main Object, and inverted the matte. Okay, so now we're cutting that out, And if we turn the background on, turn that object on, see now we're getting the little glints, but because we've cut it out with an inverted matte, we're not getting the parts that are cut out over the top of the main object, which is really nice. But one of the problems here now is that we're not getting any sort of glow on top of this main object. So that was easy. Just use Ultra Glow again. See, by putting another Ultra Glow effect on top, now we're getting that glow on top. So I really feel like those glints are moving around like a wireframe edge of this model. And as a nice little addition to that, I've used Sapphire Glare. And Sapphire Glare just picks up the hottest points here, the brightest points, and adds a little glare. So here what I did was I just chose to load a preset. And there's a range of nice little highlight glares that you can use. Things like this, subtle rays, all the subtle rays ones, subtle glare 5, subtle glare 4, all of those ones. So I grab one of those. So now it's picking up all of those really bright areas and it's adding this beautiful little glint to them. And if we come back to the main comp, we've got these lovely glints. And of course, these are not being affected by the tile scramble, so these glints are sort of moving around the entire object. And they're kind of, tracing the outline of this 3D model. So you can see here, that looks great, doesn't it? You can see how with tile scramble and the main object by itself, it looks very flat, but with that masked section there and with the wireframe on top, it looks like it has a lot more depth, which is really lovely. And of course, those Ultra Glow highlights are moving around, which makes it look even more interesting. So here's what we have so far. And while it does have a lot more depth, it could have more because it basically just goes off to blackness in the background. So to fix that, I've used Sapphire Rays as an adjustment layer. And look at the difference there. We get these beautiful rays shooting out from the back. And the reason they're going out towards the back is because I've reversed the rays. See here, reverse rays. And obviously this logo is rotating because of the camera animation that I created. So to make the rays match that move, what I've done is I've animated it. So if I just roll out a bit. So there's the ray center XY. If I grab that, you can see how I can move that around. So I started it with it out to the left, and because the model is rotated that way, and I've just set a couple of keyframes. You can see there's a second keyframe there. So as the camera rotates around, see how that slides up, and it basically stays in sync with that to make it feel like it's, in 3D space, which is really nice. You get that, infinite kind of hyper, space hyper warp look. I've given it that nice, sampled a nice burnt sort of orange color from there, and what a difference that makes. Really easy and very fast to render as well, Sapphire Rays. And just below that, not affecting the rays, is a little more Ultra Glow, just to make the logo pop out a bit more and a few of these brighter areas. And I could have used a little bit of atmosphere for that. If I wanted to make a bit of smokiness to that, that would have been nice as well. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to have smoke or, not have smoke with this. Smokiness looks pretty nice as well, especially around here. You can see that smoky look. So that's the main comp. The only thing I did other than that, and the reason I've put this into a separate composition, is because I had tile scramble. I wanted to have a little bit of dust, so I wanted to have a few particles. So let me just turn off my proxy and just come back to here. So we've got Sapphire Dust. I'm going to just turn off a couple of these effects. So just using one of the presets, and the dust is moving from left to right. This isn't a 3D effect, although it has a 3D look to it. So I couldn't put it in the composition and have it be affected by the After Effects camera. But I've mentioned this in previous tutorials. Dust is so ethereal that you can just sort of dump it on top and give it a general direction and it just looks like it's supposed to be there. So I've just dropped that in the back, have the dust drifting from left to right, and added a bit of ultra glow just to, really give them a nice soft glow there. And as a last little step, I used the displacement map effect and just used the main composition as the map. So you can see if I turn that on, so we're using the main composition to displace the dust, which just means that when because the dust is sitting behind, right? So we're seeing it through semi-transparent and transparent areas. It just means that it's being displaced by this object, which gives it a little more realistic look. So it's kind of a, refraction kind of look where we're sort of viewing it through glass. It's only subtle. We just turn it on and off. You can see it just means that there's some interaction between the main composition and the dust, rather than just having them, having one lay on top of the other. I always like to have my particles or dust or whatever feel like it's, especially when it's working with something that's semi-transparent, feel like it's being refracted slightly. So that's why I decided just to add that in, and it just adds that little extra level of detail. All right, so here's the final look again. So it's amazing how much value you can get from Blender, just creating a simple 3D model, bringing it into After Effects using the same HDRI, and a bit of camera animation, a bunch of Sapphire, and the result is pretty amazing in my opinion. All right, so hopefully you found that useful. To learn more about Sapphire, visit borisfx.com, where you can download a trial version, and there's plenty of tutorials to catch up on as well. For now, this is John. I'll see you in the next tutorial.